If you were to paint a picture of pure, unadulterated anxiety, you might just paint Richard Lewis. You'd see a man, almost always in black, looking less like a comedian and more like a poet on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And for 50 years, audiences didn't just watch, they loved him for it. He was the Prince of Pain, the comedian of anxieties, and we laughed because his panic, his confusion, his constant state of being overwhelmed, it felt, in a strange way, just like ours. Then, in early 2024, the laughter stopped. Richard Lewis passed away at 76, and the news hit harder than many expected. It felt personal, but this isn't just a tragedy. This is the story of a comedian who found staggering success but was nearly devoured by his own demons. A man who spent his life laughing at his own pain, and in doing so, gave us all permission to do the same. To understand the man who would one day be called the Prince of Pain, you have to understand the world he was born into. This wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind. Richard Philip Lewis entered the world on June 29, 1947, at Brooklyn Jewish Hospital. It's a detail that would become legendary because just 3 days later in the very same hospital, another future comedy icon was born, Larry David. Their mothers, they would later discover, were in the same recovery room, almost certainly complaining about the hospital food. It was a prelude to a friendship that would define both of their lives, a cosmic joke written 12 years before they would first meet at a summer camp, and decades before their careers would be intertwined forever. Richard grew up not in the rough and tumble Brooklyn of movies, but in the nearby, quieter, and deeply suburban town of Englewood, New Jersey. It was the picture of post-war American aspiration. His father, Bill Lewis, was a professional caterer, a man who provided the backdrop for other people's happiest moments, weddings, anniversaries, bar mitzvahs. But at home, he was often a distant, if kind, figure. He worked constantly, a ghost in his own family narrative, the dominant force in the Lewis household, the one that would shape Richard's psyche more than any other, was his mother, Blanche. Blanche Lewis was, by all of Richard's accounts, not a source of comfort. She was, to put it mildly, a character. She was a performer in her own right, holding court in the local community theater. But at home, she was critical, withholding, and perpetually unimpressed. She was, as Richard would spend a lifetime explaining to therapists and audiences, the ground zero of his neurosis. He craved her approval, her warmth, her laughter, and he almost never got it. He would perform, he would joke, he would plead for attention, and she would meet his efforts with a blank stare or a cutting remark. He once recalled that his mother was the only person I've ever known who had Alzheimer's and still wouldn't forget a grudge. The laughter this line got from audiences was hollow for him. It was the truth. He'd tell her he was going to be on The Tonight Show, a monumental achievement for any comic. And she'd respond with, "When?" Not with congratulations, just logistics. This environment created a kid who was painfully observant. He was a sponge for every subtle slight, every unspoken tension, every moment of emotional distance. He wasn't a happy child. He was an anxious one. He felt like an outsider in his own home, a visitor in his own life. He would later say, "My mother never laughed at one of my jokes. Ever." He found his escape not in sports or school, but in pop culture. He would sit in the dark, watching the pioneers of a new, dangerous kind of comedy. He worshipped Lenny Bruce, not just for his jokes, but for his courage, his willingness to bleed on stage. He studied Woody Allen, seeing a blueprint for how to turn intellectual anxiety into high art. He was drawn to the outsiders, the complainers, the ones who saw the cracks in the perfect suburban facade, and then the defining trauma. Richard was preparing for the biggest day of a young Jewish boy's life, his bar mitzvah. His father, Bill, the caterer, was planning the entire event. It was supposed to be a massive celebration. Just weeks before the ceremony, Bill Lewis, who had been a heavy smoker, suddenly collapsed. He died of a heart attack. He was only 47. The bar mitzvah was, of course, canceled. The party became a funeral. The celebration of his entry into manhood was replaced by the trauma of losing his father. For a 13-year-old boy already vibrating with anxiety, this was a cataclysm. The one figure of quiet stability in his life was gone. He was left alone with his critical mother in a profound, bottomless sense of grief. This event sealed his fate. It cemented his worldview. Life wasn't just precarious, it was inherently tragic. It was arbitrary, painful, and fundamentally unfair. The only possible response, the only way to survive the sheer absurdity of the pain was to talk about it, to dissect it, to turn it over and over until it stopped being a weapon and started being a shield. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't just processing grief. He was doing his homework. He was developing the voice that would one day make him a star. The material wasn't jokes, it was his life. And his life from that moment on was defined by the deep, unshakable belief that at any moment the floor was about to give way. This anxiety propelled him through his education. He was smart, articulate, and deeply introspective. He headed to Ohio State University trying to find a normal path. He studied advertising, a field where he could use his creativity in a structured, safe way. He was good at it. He got a job at an ad agency in New Jersey writing copy. He was, by all external measures, a success. He was on the path his mother would have approved of, stable, professional, quiet, and he was miserable, absolutely, profoundly miserable. The pull of the stage, the need to express the chaos inside him was too strong. This quiet life in advertising felt like a betrayal of his own nervous system. He'd moonlight in New York City, driving into Greenwich Village, the bohemian heart of the 1970s comedy renaissance. He'd stand in the back of clubs like the Improv or Catch a Rising Star, watching a new generation find its voice. These weren't the "Take My Wife, Please" comics of his parents' era. This was a new breed. They were young, they were angry, they were political, they were personal. He saw Andy Kaufman blur the line between performance and reality. He saw Freddie Prinze explode with charisma. And he saw his future contemporaries, Jerry Seinfeld, meticulously crafting the perfect observation, Jay Leno, honing his everyman appeal, and a loud, obnoxious, and utterly brilliant young comic named Larry David. In 1971, at the age of 24, Richard Lewis quit his advertising job. He cashed in a savings bond and dove headfirst into the uncertain, brutal, and intoxicating world of New York stand-up. In 1971, Richard Lewis was 24 years old, unemployed, and armed with nothing but a cashed-in savings bond and a nervous system that was, by his own admission, a full-blown 5-alarm fire. He had traded the cripplingly safe world of New Jersey advertising for the actual physical and emotional danger of the Greenwich Village comedy scene. To say this world was a crucible is an understatement. It was a 24/7, collaborative and cutthroat obsession, a psychological gauntlet where the only currency was a laugh and the only goal was to get 5 more minutes on a stage that smelled of stale beer, cigarettes, and desperation. This was the era of the comedy boom, but it hadn't boomed yet. It was still a tribal, almost secret society. The clubs, the Improv, Catch a Rising Star, were not just venues, they were universities, flop houses, and confessionals. Comedians didn't just go to work, they lived there. They would arrive in the late afternoon, sign up for a spot, and then wait and wait and wait. They would sit in the back, notebooks in hand, nursing a single drink for hours, studying every comic who went up. They would watch a legend like George Carlin work out a new bit, then watch a total amateur crash and burn. After their 10-minute set at 1:30 a.m., they wouldn't go home. They'd pile into a booth at a diner or hang out at the bar until 4 a.m., deconstructing every single moment. It was a life of total immersion, and for a man with an obsessive analytical mind like Richard's, it was heaven and it was hell. Richard Lewis didn't just fit in, he stood out precisely because he seemed to be the only one on stage who wasn't trying to be a comedian. While others were polishing their bits, their routines, their structured setup punchline jokes, Richard would walk on stage often clutching a long, crumpled scroll of notes that looked like a prop from a biblical film. He'd unroll it, and it would cascade to the floor. "I'm a little disorganized tonight," he'd mumble, and the audience would chuckle, not yet realizing this wasn't a bit. This was his process. He would then simply talk, or rather he would agonize. He was a man in a therapy session where the therapist had been replaced by a brick wall and a 2-drink minimum. He free associated, leaping from his dysfunctional family, my mother Blanche, to his disastrous love life, I'm on the date from hell, to his endless multiplying phobias, I have a deep-seated fear of, well, everything. He was pioneering a new form of comedy, stream of consciousness self-analysis. He was the vital missing link between the social rebellion of Lenny Bruce and the intellectual deconstruction of Woody Allen. He was taking their external observations and turning them inward, performing a live excavation of his own psyche. The look became iconic by necessity. He wore all black. This wasn't a rock and roll affectation, it was, as he famously explained, one less decision to make. In a life already burdened by a million paralyzing choices, picking a color was one variable he could eliminate. The physicality was not a performance, it was a symptom. He paced like a caged animal because he felt like one. He clutched his head because it felt like it was about to explode. He was a raw, exposed nerve, and the audience shockingly didn't recoil. They leaned in. They laughed in recognition. It was in this pressure cooker, this bullpen of future legends, that he reconnected with the boy from the Brooklyn hospital. He and Larry David, who had first met as 12-year-olds at a summer sports camp where they famously despised each other, were now two more faces in the same tribe. But they weren't just in the tribe, they were a tribe, a subsect of two. In a sea of different styles, the prop comedy of a young Gallagher, the sharp observations of a young Seinfeld, the blue-collar roar of a young Leno, they were the neurotic Jews. They were the analysts. Their friendship was immediate, total, and ferocious. They were comedy brothers, and their dynamic was set from day one. They would bicker, they would compete, they would analyze every single thing to death, and they would love each other with a defensive intensity that would last a lifetime. They were, they quickly realized, the only two people on earth who truly understood the precise frequency of each other's anxiety. They would sit in the back of Catch a Rising Star, and while other comics watched a set and said, "That was funny," Larry and Richard would deconstruct it for an hour. Why did he use the word automobile instead of car? Car is funnier. Automobile is 4 syllables. It's slowing the rhythm. It's a disaster. His life is over. They were each other's mirror and each other's foil. They saw in each other the same bottomless pit of self-doubt and existential dread, and instead of running from it, they dove in together. Their arguments were, and would always be, a form of intimacy. They were two masters sharpening each other's blades night after night. For 3 years, Richard worked. He refined this non-act. He was building a following, becoming a comedian's comedian, a stamp of approval that meant you were brilliant but probably unmarketable. But the one market that mattered, the kingmaker, the absolute pinnacle of the entire show business mountain, was The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. A good set on Carson could make your career overnight. A bad one, or worse, an indifferent one, could end it. In 1974, Richard Lewis, a 27-year-old bundle of nerves in a dark suit, got the call. He walked out onto that hallowed stage in front of the man from Nebraska, the king of Midwestern cool, and he proceeded to unload. He didn't tell jokes. He riffed on his paranoia, his therapy, his deep-seated unsuitability for human existence. He was a whirlwind of black fabric and flailing limbs. The camera cut to Johnny. Carson, a man who had seen everything, was fascinated. He wasn't just laughing. He was studying Richard as if he were a newly discovered and possibly dangerous species of animal. The set ended. The applause was huge. Richard, shaking, looked over. And then it happened. The ultimate validation. The knighting. Johnny Carson, the king of late night, laughed and gestured for Richard to come sit on the coveted couch. In that moment, Richard Lewis was no longer a club comic. He was a star. It was the ultimate validation, not just for him, but for his style. It was proof that his anxiety wasn't a bug, it was the feature. His mother may not have laughed, but Johnny Carson did. This kicked off a relentless decade. Richard Lewis became a fixture on television. He was a regular guest on the Merv Griffin Show and the Mike Douglas Show. He moved to Los Angeles, the next logical step. But his true television home, the place that would catapult him from star to icon, began in 1982. It was a new, weird, and dangerous show, Late Night with David Letterman. If Carson was the king, Letterman was the usurper. Dave, who had come up through the exact same comedy club trenches, understood Richard in a way the polished establishment Carson never could. Letterman's show was edgy, ironic, and perfect for Richard's chaotic energy. An appearance on Letterman wasn't a polite interview. It was a psychological event. Lewis would come on, sit down, and the two would just go. It was like watching two jazz musicians in a high-stakes improvisation. Lewis would launch into a 10-minute stream of consciousness rant about a recent catastrophe, and Letterman, with his quick Midwestern punk counterpunch, would dissect, mock, and amplify it. Audiences loved it. He became one of the show's most frequent and beloved guests, appearing dozens of times. He was building his national brand, one televised nervous breakdown at a time. By the mid-1980s, Richard Lewis was no longer a struggling artist. He was a bona fide superstar. He had his own HBO specials, like the perfectly titled I'm in Pain, 1985, which took his club act uncensored and uncut to a massive audience. He was selling out concert halls, including a legendary performance at Carnegie Hall. He had officially, indisputably, been crowned by critics and fans as the Prince of Pain, and he had created a lexicon. His signature phrase, "the blank from hell," had entered the public consciousness. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. It was a way to categorize and control the chaos. By naming it the flight from hell, he could contain the experience, package it, and sell it as a joke, thus robbing it of its power over him. Or so it seemed. He was at the absolute peak of the comedy world. He had the money, the fame, the celebrity, and the universal respect of his peers. And with that title and all those spoils came the darkness. The 1980s comedy boom was fueled by more than just laughter and applause. For many of its stars, it was fueled by cocaine and alcohol. And for a man whose entire being was already a raw, exposed nerve, a man who had spent his childhood trying to get a laugh from a stone-cold mother, and his 20s trying to get a laugh from a room full of strangers, the temptation to numb the pain, to quiet the relentless static, was irresistible. Success didn't fix Richard Lewis. It didn't quiet the noise in his head. It amplified it. The anxiety that was once his fuel was now threatening to burn him alive. The pressure was immense. He wasn't just a comedian anymore. He was a character. He had to be Richard Lewis, Prince of Pain, every single night on stage, on Letterman, in restaurants, at parties. The persona was devouring the person, and the person was terrified. He began to drink heavily. He used cocaine. This wasn't the casual social use of the era. It was a desperate, deep-seated addiction. It was self-medication on a terrifying scale. He was chasing a high that would finally make his brain shut up even for a few hours. He was seeking the warmth and approval he never got from Blanche, and he found it in a bottle and a powder. His friends saw it. Larry David saw it. Jerry Seinfeld saw it. They were worried. Their friend, the man they had come up with, the brilliant analyst, was becoming a casualty of his own success. But Richard was in the grip of something bigger than himself, bigger than his intellect, bigger than his willpower. His work, which had always been so sharp and analytical, began to suffer, even if the public didn't always see it. The line between his persona, the out-of-control, wild neurotic on stage, and the man who was actually out of control, was disappearing. He was becoming a parody of himself, but it wasn't a joke. Then in 1989 came the biggest opportunity of his career, The Brass Ring. He was cast opposite the rising movie star Jamie Lee Curtis in a new sitcom for ABC. It was called Anything But Love. This was his shot at the mainstream, at the kind of crossover stardom his contemporaries like Seinfeld would soon achieve. The show was a smart, witty, romantic comedy centered on two writers at a Chicago magazine who fall in love. The chemistry between Lewis and Curtis was immediate, electric, and very, very real. Jamie Lee Curtis was, in her own way, as intelligent and intense as Richard. She was Scream Queen royalty, but she was also a sharp, probing, and deeply authentic person. Crucially, she was also in recovery from her own addictions. She was a stabilizing, sober force in his chaotic life. Their on-screen banter was brilliant because it was steeped in a shared, unspoken understanding of personal struggle and intellectual warfare. The show was a critical hit. Critics loved the smart writing and the genuine sparking chemistry between the leads. And for the first time, Richard Lewis was a romantic lead. He wasn't just the crazy sidekick. He was the anxious, dark, intellectual hero. And audiences, especially women, responded. He was the bad boy for the mind. The show ran for 4 successful seasons, a solid, undeniable hit. But behind the scenes, Richard's battle was raging. He was a total professional on set. He never missed a line, never showed up drunk or high to work. He was, in his own words, a high-functioning alcoholic and addict, a man who could still deliver a perfect performance, make a room full of writers laugh, and charm a network executive, all while his personal life was crumbling to dust. He was isolated. The addictions pushed people away. The man whose comedy was built on connection, on the desperate need to be understood, was now profoundly, terribly alone. He was trapped in a golden cage, a cycle of performance, self-medication, and crushing private despair. In 1992, after 4 seasons and 56 episodes, ABC abruptly canceled Anything But Love. And just like that, the structure that had held him together, the 5 a.m. wake-up calls, the 12-hour-a-day shooting schedules, the responsibility to his cast and crew, the stabilizing daily presence of Jamie Lee Curtis, was gone. Richard Lewis, the Prince of Pain, was untethered, and with nothing to hold on to, he fell straight into a black hole. The cancellation of Anything But Love in 1992 was not just a career setback. It was the severing of the last tether. For 4 seasons, the show had been a force structure, a non-negotiable scaffolding that held Richard Lewis's life in place. It demanded he be at a certain place at a certain time. It demanded he be lucid, professional, and present. The schedule, the 5 a.m. wake-up calls, the 12-hour-a-day shoots, the lines to be memorized, the collaborative energy of a cast and crew was a form of involuntary high-stakes rehab. More than that, it was the daily stabilizing presence of his co-star, Jamie Lee Curtis, a woman of sharp intelligence and, crucially, a woman in sober recovery. She was a living, breathing testament to the fact that one could be brilliant, successful, and clean. She was a model and a silent, supportive witness. And then, with a simple network decision, she was gone. The set was struck. The call time stopped. The scaffolding was ripped away. Richard Lewis, the Prince of Pain, was left untethered, standing at the edge of a black hole with a pocket full of money and a brain that was screaming for silence. He fell into it. The 2 years that followed, from 1992 to 1994, were not a lost weekend in the poetic, cinematic sense. It was a lost weekend in the literal, terrifying definition of the term, a dark, terrifying, and seemingly endless spiral into the absolute depths of his addiction. The Prince of Pain was no longer a nickname, a clever stage persona. It was a literal, 24-hour-a-day description of his existence. The high-functioning addict was gone. The functioning part was now a distant memory. His life, which had always been a battle fought on the internal psychological plane, was now a purely physical one. The need to acquire, the need to use, the need to numb. The man who had built a career on analyzing every nuance of his own suffering was now singularly focused on not feeling it. He was drinking heavily every day from the moment he woke up. The cocaine use, once a companion to the alcohol, was now a necessity to keep the machine from shutting down entirely. His career, which had been so bright, was not just stalling, it was disintegrating. He was still performing stand-up, but the performances were becoming erratic, then notorious. Club owners, who had once battled to book the superstar Richard Lewis, were now nervous to put him on their marquee. Would he show up? What would show up? The man who arrived was often a ghost of himself. The brilliant rapid-fire analysis was replaced by a slow, pained, and sometimes incoherent rant. The line, the sacred contract between a comedian and his audience, was gone. He was no longer a man analyzing his pain for their amusement. He was just a man in pain. Audiences, who had once laughed in recognition, now watched in a kind of horrified silence. The Prince of Pain persona had become a grim, real-life spectacle. He wasn't bleeding metaphorically anymore. The alienation was total. The friends who had been his bedrock, his tribe, were pushed to the margins. This was the era of Seinfeld's absolute world-dominating peak. His two closest brothers, Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld, were the kings of television, the architects of the most successful sitcom in history. The contrast was agonizing. As they were building an empire, he was meticulously dismantling his own. Their worried calls, once met with his signature bickering and loving insults, were now met with hostility, deflection, or, most terrifyingly, silence. The bickering, which had always been their form of intimacy, was no longer funny. It was real. It was dark. And it was desperate. "You're killing yourself, Richard," they would plead. He would respond with rage, accusing them of not understanding, of being judgmental, of abandoning him. All the while, he was the one who had locked the door and thrown away the key. He was isolating himself from the only people on earth who truly understood the architecture of his mind. The industry, which lives on reliability, deemed him a liability. The phone stopped ringing. The agents and managers, who had once clamored for a percentage of his multi-million-dollar career, grew distant. He was becoming uninsurable, the final kiss of death in Hollywood. The brand Richard Lewis was now toxic. He was, by his own admission, dying. He was a man in his mid-40s, and he was convinced he would not see 50. He was trapped in his Los Angeles home, a beautiful prison, a man who had achieved every dream he had ever had, and he was profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The irony was suffocating. The comedian whose entire act was built on connection and a desperate plea to be understood was now completely, utterly, and terminally on his own. The moment of clarity, the rock bottom that is so often a cliche in stories of recovery, was for Richard horrifyingly real. It was not a single cinematic "I've got to change my life" revelation. It was a physical, biological surrender. It was August 4th, 1994. He was in his home, alone. He had been on a days-long bender of alcohol and drugs, a final desperate attempt to carpet bomb his nervous system into submission. But this time, his body, which had absorbed a truly staggering amount of poison for over a decade, finally broke. He was in unimaginable pain. Not the familiar, existential dread he had turned into art, but a new, visceral physical pain. He was, he later described with chilling clarity, convinced he was dying. Right there, on his floor. He was bleeding internally. His organs were shutting down. The self-medication had become simple, straightforward poison. This was a new kind of hell. This was a pain his wit couldn't touch, a terror his intellect couldn't analyze its way out of. He was at last speechless. The man who had used 1,000,000 words to describe his suffering had no words for this. He fell to his knees in his living room, and Richard Lewis, the secular, analytical, post-Freudian, neurotic Jew who had built a career on mocking his own pain and the absurdity of existence, did the one thing he never ever thought he would do. He prayed. It was not a sophisticated plea. It was not a theological debate. It was the desperate primal gasp of a dying animal. "I can't do this anymore," he said, to the ceiling, to the universe, to whatever. "I'm done. Please, God, just get me through this. I will never drink again. I will do anything." It was not a plea from a comedian. It was a surrender. It was the white flag from a man who had been at war with himself his entire life. Somehow, with a final surge of adrenaline, he managed to get himself to a hospital. The doctors who examined him were blunt. His own diagnosis had not been hyperbole. He was severely, critically ill from his alcoholism and drug use. His body was in systemic failure. They were not talking about long-term health risks. They were talking about days. He was, in no uncertain terms, killing himself. The doctor's words were the objective, medical, scientific truth that his brain, which could argue its way out of anything, could not refute. He was checkmated. That day, August 4th, 1994, became his new birthday. It was the day Richard Lewis, the Prince of Pain, died, and Richard Lewis, the man, began the long, agonizing, and profoundly unglamorous fight to be reborn. Sobriety was not a magic wand. It was not a peaceful awakening. It was a brutal, day-by-day, hour-by-hour war, fought on two fronts. First, there was the physical war, the detox, the chemical withdrawal, the shakes, the cold sweats, the physical reality of a body screaming for the poison it had come to depend on. This was a crude, ugly, and necessary battle. But the second war, the psychological one, was far harder. For his entire adult life, Richard had used alcohol and drugs to mute the relentless, deafening static in his brain, the anxiety he was born with, the grief from his father's death, the critical, joyless voice of his mother, Blanche. Now, in sobriety, that static was back, and it was louder than it had ever been. and he had no armor. He had to learn how to live, how to be in the world, how to wake up and make breakfast, how to answer the telephone, how to sit with himself, sober, for 10 minutes. His therapy, which had always been material for his act, now became his literal lifeline. He threw himself into recovery programs, into therapy, into anything that offered a path forward, with the same obsessive, all-consuming energy he had once thrown into his comedy and his addictions. And then he had to face the most terrifying challenge of all, the stage. How do you be Richard Lewis, Prince of Pain, when the chemicals that you thought were the source of that persona are gone? He had to walk out on stage, under the hot lights, in front of a paying audience, completely sober, and still be funny. It was, he said, the most frightening thing he had ever done. He had to learn how to be vulnerable, truly vulnerable, without a safety net. His comedy, by necessity, began to change. It was still dark, it was still analytical, but the desperation was gone. It was no longer a raw scream for help. It was the work of a man mapping his own scars, a man reporting back from the front lines of a war he had narrowly, miraculously survived. During this period, the mid to late 1990s, the comedy world he had helped build had moved on. The comedy boom of the 1980s was a distant, slightly embarrassing memory. His friend, Jerry Seinfeld, was the undisputed king of television. A new generation of alternative comedians was rising, performing in smaller rooms, deconstructing the very idea of stand-up. Richard Lewis, the icon of that 80s era, was seen by many in the industry as a relic, a whatever happened to guy. He was in the wilderness. He was clean, he was alive, but he was isolated. He still performed, but the massive audiences and the television spotlight had faded. He wrote a book, The Other Great Depression, a raw, unflinching, and deeply unfunny memoir about his struggles. It was his inventory, his confession. It was a critical piece of his recovery, but it did not set the world on fire. He was a man out of time. He was a legend whom the industry had largely and quietly passed by. He had confronted his demons and won a brutal, bloody victory. And his reward, it seemed, was to be forgotten. He was clean, he was sober, he was alive, and he was irrelevant. He was adrift, artistically and professionally, waiting for a signal, a sign that his second chance at life included a second chance at a career. And then, in 1999, after 5 long years in the sober wilderness, the phone rang. In 1999, Richard Lewis was a ghost haunting the ruins of his own career. He was 52 years old. He was most miraculously 5 years sober. This was a monumental day-by-day victory, a private war he had won against staggering odds. But the spoils of this victory were quiet, internal, and invisible. To the outside world, to the industry that had once crowned him, he was a relic. The Prince of Pain had become a whatever happened to story, a cautionary tale from the cocaine-dusted, neon-lit 1980s comedy boom. He was in the wilderness. His friend and brother Jerry Seinfeld had just concluded the 9-year run of the most successful sitcom in television history. His other brother, Larry David, the co-creator of that empire, was now a figure of mythic, near-invisible wealth. And Richard, their contemporary, their peer, the third point in their neurotic triangle, was performing in half-empty clubs, his name a dim echo. He was clean, he was alive, but he was irrelevant. And then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was nasal, unmistakable, and perpetually aggrieved. It was Larry David. There was no small talk. There never was with Larry. He was working on something new, a one-off special for HBO. The concept was strange, meta, and revolutionary. It was a mockumentary, following Larry David as he prepared to return to stand-up comedy, navigating the absurd, petty, and infuriating minutiae of his life in Los Angeles. It was called Larry David, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Larry's idea was simple, and in its simplicity, it was an act of profound loyalty. He wanted his friends to play themselves, or rather, he wanted them to play the version of themselves that he bickered with in real life. He called Richard, and the offer was essentially, I want you to play Richard Lewis. I want us to do on camera what we do in restaurants. For Richard, this was not a gig. It was a lifeline. It was a resurrection. This was not a network executive taking a risk or an agent doing a favor. This was his oldest friend, the man from the Brooklyn hospital, the man who had sat next to him in the back of Catch a Rising Star in 1973, the man who had watched him nearly kill himself in the early 90s, the man Richard had, in his darkest days, pushed away with rage and denial. And this was the man who is now reaching back across that chasm, handing him a rope. It was an act of supreme trust. Larry David was staking his new, high-profile post-Seinfeld project on his friend, trusting him to be sober, trusting him to be present, and most of all, trusting him to be brilliant. The 1999 special was a massive, critical word-of-mouth success. HBO, recognizing it had bottled lightning, immediately ordered a full series. And Curb Your Enthusiasm became a cultural phenomenon, a second Mount, Rushmore-level act for Larry David, and, crucially, a complete and total resurrection for Richard Lewis. His role on Curb was a stroke of singular genius, a perfect fusion of reality and fiction. He wasn't the Prince of Pain from the 1980s, pacing the stage and clutching his head in a performative frenzy. He was Richard Lewis, Larry's oldest friend, his comic foil, and his emotional punching bag. He was the only character in Larry's universe who was, in every way, Larry's equal, just as neurotic, just as self-absorbed, and just as capable of turning a meaningless social convention into a life-or-death moral crusade. Their scenes together were masterpieces of improvised comedy, but they were rooted in something profoundly real. They were not acting. They were reacting, drawing on a 30-year shared language of anxiety. When Richard and Larry argued on screen, audiences were watching the distilled, perfected essence of their real-life friendship. They were watching the two boys from the Brooklyn hospital, now middle-aged, wealthy men, still driving each other completely, hopelessly insane. The arguments became legendary, a perfect encapsulation of their dynamic. They would argue about whether a sweater was a good gift. They would have a blistering existential fight over whose beloved aunt, a woman neither of them had seen in 20 years, deserved more sympathy. They would, in one of their most iconic scenes, have a near-violent disagreement about which of them was leaving the other more money in their will, an argument that was, at its core, a desperate, childish, and beautiful fight over who loved the other more. The show did something incredible. It introduced Richard Lewis to an entirely new generation. Viewers who had never seen his 1985 HBO special, who had no concept of The Date from Hell, now knew him as Richard Lewis from Curb. He was Larry's perpetually aggrieved, women-obsessed, and reliably hilarious friend. The role was a perfect fit, a bespoke suit, because it was him. It was the him that existed before the fame, before the persona, before the addiction, before the fall. It was the Richard Lewis that Larry David had known and loved since 1971. Curb didn't just give him his career back, it gave him his identity back. He was no longer a tragic relic. He was a legend, rightfully returned to his throne, sitting opposite his brother, bickering for eternity. The industry, which had written him off as a liability, now saw him as an icon. The phone began to ring again. He was in demand. He was back. And just as this profound professional resurrection was taking place, an even more profound and far more unlikely resurrection was happening in his personal life. The man who had built a career on the date from hell had been, by his own unflinching admission, a disaster in relationships. His entire life had been a search for the validation and warmth he never received from his mother, and he had looked for it in all the wrong places. His anxiety, his relentless self-obsession, and his crippling addictions had made a healthy long-term relationship an impossibility. His life was a revolving door of chaotic, dramatic, and short-lived affairs, all of them perfect material for his act, all of them private disasters. He was now in his 50s. He was sober. He was, thanks to Curb, successful again. But he was profoundly lonely. The Prince of Pain was a bachelor, living alone, a man who could connect with thousands of strangers from a stage, but could not maintain a connection with one person. In 1998, just a year before the Curb phone call, in that quiet, sober wilderness, he was at a Ringo Starr album release party. He was introduced to a woman named Joyce Lipinski. She was not an actress. She was not a comedian. She was not in the scene. She worked in music publishing. She was, as he would later describe her, smart, funny, grounded, and, this was the crucial part, completely and totally unfazed by his celebrity, his history, or his neurosis. She was not looking to fix the broken comedian. She was not interested in the Prince of Pain. She just liked Richard. This was new. And for the first time in his life, Richard Lewis was in a place where he could be in a healthy relationship. He had done the work. He was sober. He was stable. He had spent 4 years in recovery, learning how to simply be himself, without the chemical armor, without the performative persona. He was no longer looking for a savior, a mother, or an audience. He was just a man, hoping to find a partner. Their relationship was a slow burn. This in itself was the most radical thing he had ever done. His life had been defined by chaos, by high drama, by the from hell dynamic. His relationship with Joyce was the opposite. It was calm, it was steady, it was normal. They dated for 7 years. For Richard Lewis, a man who lived in a state of constant panic and catastrophic thinking, a 7-year stable and loving relationship was a greater achievement than getting on Carson. It was an act of profound, terrifying bravery. In 2005, Richard Lewis, the perennial bachelor, the poster child for romantic dysfunction, the man who had built a life on being unlovable, got married. He was 58 years old. Joyce Lipinski became his anchor. He would credit her, unequivocally, with saving his life. Not from the addiction, he had done that work himself, but from himself, from the anxiety, from the self-loathing, from the deep core belief that he was destined to be alone. She provided the peace, the quiet, the unconditional stability that he had been searching for since he was a 13-year-old boy whose father had been ripped away, leaving him alone with a critical, unloving mother. He had spent a lifetime chasing the approval of a woman who would never laugh. He finally, in his 50s, found a partner who loved him for exactly who he was, anxiety and all, and who filled his home with a laughter that was real. His life for the first time settled into a rhythm he had never known. The chaos was gone. He had his wife, his anchor. He had his sobriety, his rock. And he had Curb Your Enthusiasm, his artistic home. He continued to tour, to perform stand-up, but the desperation was gone. The act was no longer a raw scream for help. It was the work of a master, an elder statesman. He was still the Prince of Pain, but the pain was no longer a weapon attacking him. It was a scar he could map, a territory he could report back from with wisdom, grace, and as always, devastating humor. He was for the first time in his life at peace. He was happy. He was stable. He was loved. Of course, for a man whose entire existence was defined by cosmic irony, a man whose worldview was built on the fundamental belief that disaster was always just around the corner, that peace could not last. For Richard Lewis, the first decade of the 21st century and well into the 2000s represented a state of being he had only ever used as a punchline: peace. His life, once a Category 5 hurricane of anxiety, addiction, and professional chaos, had settled into an almost impossibly calm rhythm. He was a man reborn, living a life that was the complete inverse of his stage persona. He was sober, a victory he honored every single day with the grim, grateful diligence of a man who had walked out of his own tomb. He was married, anchored by a deep, stable, and quiet love with his wife, Joyce Lipinski, a love that didn't demand performance, only presence. Professionally, he was no longer a relic, but an icon, a universally respected elder statesman. His recurring scene-stealing role on Curb Your Enthusiasm had cemented his legacy, introducing his specific brand of hilarious misery to a new generation. He continued to tour, but the desperation was gone. He no longer stalked the stage as a man screaming for help. He held it as a master craftsman, a man who had been to hell and back and could now, with sober clarity, report on the absurdity of the journey. He had, for the first time in his life, found a balance. The Prince of Pain was, in private, a man at peace. And then, for a man whose entire existence was defined by cosmic irony, a man whose core belief was that the floor was always about to give way, life prepared to play its final, cruelest, and most profoundly unfunny joke. The universe, it seemed, had one last from hell up its sleeve. It began subtly around 2019. Richard, a man who, since getting sober, had become almost fanatically devoted to his health, to exercise, to nutrition, began to feel his body betray him. It wasn't the mind, the enemy he had fought and tamed for 50 years. It was the vessel, a tremor in his hand that he tried to ignore, a new unshakable stiffness in his walk. The man whose physical energy on stage was his trademark, the wild gesticulations, the frantic pacing, the human-sized exclamation point of panic, was finding it harder and harder to move. His body, his instrument, was going out of tune. It wasn't a straight line to the final diagnosis. It was a hellish, multi-year medical odyssey. He underwent multiple grueling surgeries, one on his back, one on his shoulder. He was in and out of hospitals, a place that was, for his specific brand of hypochondria-fueled anxiety, a living nightmare. Each surgery required a long, painful rehabilitation. And through it all, the underlying progressive symptoms worsened. Finally, in 2021, after a seemingly endless battery of tests, he received the diagnosis he had been dreading, the one that explained the tremors, the stiffness, the betrayal. He had Parkinson's disease. For a comedian, this diagnosis is a nightmare. For a physical comedian like Richard Lewis, it was a unique and devastating blow. Parkinson's is a progressive neurological disorder that attacks the motor system. It is a disease that robs you of control over your own body. For a man whose entire life had been a quest for control over his anxiety, over his addiction, over his audience, this was the ultimate unwinnable irony. It was, as he would later say, the mother of all from hells. He kept the diagnosis private for 2 years. He and his wife Joyce retreated, grappling with the news, with the fear, and with the brutal physical reality of the disease. He was facing the greatest challenge of his life, one that his wit, his intellect and his hard-won sobriety could not defeat. The professional impact was immediate and heartbreaking. First, he had to make the decision that, for any other comedian, would be unthinkable. He had to retire from stand-up comedy. The stage, which had been his sanctuary, his therapist's couch, and his identity for half a century, was no longer a safe place. The physical toll, the travel, the energy, the simple act of standing and performing for 90 minutes was now impossible. The man who had survived the comedy club wars, the addictions, the cancellations, and the wilderness years was finally being forced off the stage, not by a bad audience, but by his own rebellious cells. Then came the next blow. As production for season 11 of Curb Your Enthusiasm began, Richard had to make another phone call, this one to his oldest friend. He was in too much pain, recovering from too many surgeries and grappling with the new, terrifying symptoms. He couldn't do it. He announced publicly that he would not be appearing in the upcoming season. The public outcry was immense, a testament to how integral his character had become to the show's DNA. A season of Curb without a Richard Lewis-Larry David argument felt wrong, incomplete. It was like The Honeymooners without Norton, or The Odd Couple with only one man. But then, in a testament to his sheer force of will and to the deep, abiding love he shared with Larry David, he managed to rally. He was not going to let his story end that way. He felt well enough for one single day to film. He willed himself onto the set, recovered from his surgeries, but now clearly battling the onset of Parkinson's. He filmed one single, powerful episode. He returned, looking frail, but with his comic spark absolutely undiminished, to bicker with Larry one more time. It was a heroic effort, a statement that he was not gone yet. Then came the news that season 12 would be the show's last. This, it seemed, lit a final fire in him. He was not going to miss the end. He willed himself back. He gathered his strength. When season 12 began filming in 2023, Richard Lewis was there. He appeared in several episodes, a fixture, a presence, a man determined to finish the run. Watching those final episodes, which aired in early 2024, is almost unbearably poignant. He is visibly frail. His voice is weaker, thinner. He is often seated. The wild, frenetic energy of the Prince of Pain is gone, replaced by the quiet, dignified stillness of a man facing his own mortality. But he is there. He is present. And his mind, his wit, his timing is as sharp as it ever was. He is sitting across from Larry David, and he is giving it everything he has left. Their final scene together, in what would be Richard's last ever on-screen appearance, is a perfect, accidental, and beautiful goodbye. The two of them are, of course, bickering. They are fittingly arguing about Richard's will, with Richard accusing Larry of being a bad friend while simultaneously making sure Larry's taken care of. It's the scene they have been playing in one form or another since 1971. It's two brothers at the very end of their lives, masking their profound, bottomless love for each other in the only language they've ever known, the bicker. It's a perfect final grace note. In April 2023, with the final season in the can but before it aired, Richard decided it was time to go public. He posted a video online explaining his diagnosis to his fans. The man in the video was not the Prince of Pain. He was not the neurotic, flailing comic. He was a calm, centered, and reflective man, speaking with a quiet dignity. He explained the Parkinson's. He explained his retirement from stand-up. He expressed his gratitude for his wife, for his friends, for his career. And in the end, he looked at the camera and said, with no trace of irony, "I'm a lucky man." He had survived his family. He had survived his addictions. He had survived the brutal, unforgiving world of show business. He had found a great love. and he was facing his final unwinnable battle, not with his signature panic, but with a profound hard-won grace. On February 27, 2024, just as the final season of Curb was being celebrated by the world, Richard Lewis died at his home in Los Angeles. The cause was a heart attack, following his long private battle with Parkinson's. He was 76. The wave of grief from the comedy world and from the fans who had grown up with him was staggering. It was immediate, deep, and intensely personal. This wasn't just the loss of a funny man, it was the loss of a totem, a spokesman for the anxious and the overwhelmed. The tributes poured in, but two in particular captured the totality of his life. Jamie Lee Curtis, his co-star from Anything But Love, the woman who had been his professional partner during his darkest days of addiction, wrote, "He made me laugh, which is the only thing that matters. He was a king." And then came the statement from Larry David. It was short, perfect, and the most beautiful, loving, and fitting epitaph a friend could ever write. Richard and I were born 3 days apart in the same hospital, and for most of my life he's been like a brother to me. He had that rare combination of being the funniest person and also the sweetest. But today he made me sob, and for that, I'll never forgive him. The legacy of Richard Lewis is so much larger than just the guy from Curb or the comedian in black. He was a bridge. He was the essential link between the confessional, dangerous comedy of Lenny Bruce and the modern generation of comedians, podcasters, and performers who built careers on radical vulnerability. Before Richard Lewis, male comedians, by and large, didn't talk about their feelings. They didn't talk about therapy, about anxiety, about insecurity, about depression. It was considered weak, unmanly. Richard made vulnerability his armor. He took his anxiety, his self-loathing, his deepest, darkest fears, and he put them on stage under a spotlight. He performed a 50-year-long magic trick. He took his private pain and transformed it into public joy. He wasn't just the Prince of Pain, he was the king of processing it. He gave an entire generation of audiences, especially those of us who feel overwhelmed by the world, a voice. He showed us that our flaws, our neuroses, and our unfixable parts are not just burdens to be carried. They are, in fact, the very things that make us human. They can even be the source of our greatest strength. His life was a study in contradictions. He was a man who craved love but pushed it away. A man who achieved spectacular fame but felt like a total failure. A man who nearly died from self-destruction, only to find a profound peace in sobriety and a quiet life. He spent a lifetime convinced that the world was ending, that disaster was around every corner, that he was living the life from hell. But in the end, he was a man who died sober, successful, and deeply, truly loved. It turns out, against all odds, he had built the life from heaven after all. He just needed to get out of his own way to see it.